Welcome to Financial Repression Authority's Roundtable Insight, where the best fund managers, economists, and industry leaders discuss the key investment issues and challenges in the current macroeconomic environment.
Hi, welcome to FRA's Roundtable Insight. This is Richard Bernoulli. Today we have Charles Hugh Smith. He's author, leading global finance blogger, and America's philosopher, we call him. He's the author of many books on our economy and society, including A Radically Beneficial World, Automation, Technology, and Creating Jobs for All, Resistance, Revolution, Liberation, A Model for Positive Change, and The Nearly Free University in the Emerging Economy, and also recently a book called Pathfinding Our Destiny, Preventing the Final Fall of Our Democratic Republic. And most recently, his last book is Will You Be Richer or Poorer? Profit, Power, and AI in a Traumatized World. He's also has a blog of twominds.com, and that's one of CNBC's top alternative finance sites. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Richard. It's always a pleasure.
Great. I thought today we'd do a discussion based in part what I observed when I was in Vienna, Austria. I attended the Austrian Economics Conference there in Vienna a couple of weeks ago and did a presentation. And I also did a day trip to Budapest, Hungary in Eastern Europe. And it occurred to me at that time that Eastern Europe could be the go-to place as things begin to unfold in the indebted Western world. And so we'd like to explore that thought. Does it make sense? What are the drivers behind that? And also it ties into your book on Pathfinding Our Destiny. So we just wanted to explore that. So what are your initial thoughts?
Well, I'm real excited to hear what you your conclusions from what you saw. So yeah, I think it fits in with a theme that we've discussed in previous shows about the difference between locales or political regions that pursue financial repression, like raising taxes and trapping taxpayers in every way possible, as opposed to places where where capital, intellectual capital, and financial capital is more welcomed. You know, with flat taxes and easier lower barriers of entry to starting new businesses and so on. So I'm real interested in hearing what you have to say about what you observed in that context.
Yeah, and the whole driver for this is what's happening in the indebted Western world. So John Malden had a great piece today on how the debt crisis is evolving and the associated pension crisis as part of that, and it's pretty dire. He actually quotes also another piece that was done by Ray Dalio of Bridgewater, and his piece is called "The World Has Gone Mad and the System is Broken." And it's interesting that Ray Dalio mentions in that article that rich capitalists will increasingly move to places in which wealth gaps and conflicts are less severe. And government officials in those losing the big taxpayers will increasingly try to find ways to trap them. So it's all about the financial repression of these big taxpayers. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and it brings to mind something else that we've discussed on several recent shows, which is the realities, the financial realities facing the millennial generation globally, and we were discussing like what opportunities existed for the millennials, despite the fact that they're burdened by bloated pensions promised to the boomer generation, and many other well understood topics. But I'm curious, what was your sense of the millennial generation in Eastern Europe in terms of opportunities and the context of their lives?
Yeah, it was actually a big observation that occurred to me that the millennials in the indebted Western world are much different than the millennials in Eastern Europe. And that's due because of the experience that Eastern Europe had with extreme socialism and communism. And many feel that they do not want to go back to that. They do not want to have that happen to their generation, based on their experience when they were younger, or on their parents' experience during that time of the Soviet era, relative to the indebted Western world, which has not experienced as yet extreme socialism or communism. And we hear a lot about the millennial socialism trends in the indebted Western world, given all of the challenges of the emerging debt crisis, pension crisis, which is unsustainable and represents massive amounts of unfunded liability. So I think, just based on that, it's unlikely that the Eastern Europe will tend in the same direction as the indebted Western world. Your thoughts?
Yeah. What did you, it makes me want to know, what did you discover about the tax rates in some of the Eastern European nations, and also the cost of living? Because when I look at the millennial generation here in North America, I mean, one of the biggest obstacles is just so obvious, nobody talks about it, which is the cost of living is so high that tens of millions of people are essentially impoverished because they cannot afford uh, what previous generations had on their existing pay. So I'm real curious about the tax rates and cost of living that you observed.
Yeah, exactly. So I basically, in Bulgaria, Hungary, Czech Republic, Romania, a lot of these places are based on flat taxes. So you don't have this progressive type of taxation system as in the indebted Western world. And furthermore, the rates are very low. So Bulgaria, 10%, Hungary, 15%, Czech Republic, 15%, Romania, 10%. And in most cases, this applies to not only the personal rate, but also the corporate rate. So it's much, much lower than, if you think of maybe what it was during the Soviet era, whatever that rate was, close to 100% if you're going towards communism. And so this is happening already in Illinois, as the taxation there goes through the roof to address the pension crisis, the debt crisis there. You have already brain drain and wealth drain happening from a U.S. state, the U.S. state of Illinois, to other U.S. states. But if this happens on a national scale, I mean, then we're talking international movement of brain drain and wealth drain out of the indebted Western world. And so the question becomes, where are they going to go to? Just a side note, in Illinois, there is strong indication on millennials leaving. So they are not staying in Illinois and being sort of hard to leave in the sense of becoming more philosophical in trying to stay and coming up with solutions. They're literally leaving the state of Illinois and going to other places. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, Richard, because John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous economist, he wrote a book in the 80s, and it was a slim volume. So, and I think it was largely overlooked. But he was talking about global poverty, and his conclusion was really the simplest way to escape poverty is to simply move. In other words, physically move to a more prosperous place. And so, and more prosperous doesn't mean it means a number of things, right? In my latest book, Will You Be Richer or Poorer? I talk about intangible capital, which includes like social stability, shared sense of purpose, these kinds of forms of social capital that are super important. Forms of well-being and wealth, but we don't measure them. That's very difficult to measure them, so they don't get counted like GDP or average wages. But so when we look at Western Europe, we see a lot of division, divisiveness, social turmoil. And I'm wondering if you feel that Eastern Europe appears to be wealthier, never mind its GDP or per capita income. It may be that Eastern Europe is wealthier in social stability, right? And so that would be another reason that it would be very attractive. Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, absolutely. It fits quite well with your last book here on will you be richer or poorer, because the nature of capital comes in many forms, not just financial. And I mean, I saw the economy literally teeming, relative to Western Europe, to Vienna, and it's only a 2-hour train ride from Vienna to Budapest, but a huge difference in economic activity and in security. So the point you mentioned is interesting, because the other go-to places, if you have brain drain and wealth drain, a lot of people have talked about is Asia, or Southeast Asia in particular, Singapore, Thailand. A lot of people mention, and others mention South America, Argentina, Chile. But a lot of these places are either nominally secure or beset by a number of social issues and challenges.
Yeah, exactly. And so Eastern Europe may very well be an island of relative stability. And I would guess, now I don't have I didn't look this up before our program, it just occurred to me, but I suspect that their Gini ratio, in other words, the wealth inequality in their societies is probably considerably lower than in places like the US and other over indebted countries that may look good on paper in terms of GDP and so on, but are actually less attractive. I have another question: is do you have a sense that the Eastern European governments are actually actively seeking, fresh blood and fresh capital?
Yeah, there's a lot of development there, in the sense of some countries offering visa programs to attract foreign international talent in setting up new ventures, innovation industries. And in fact, a couple of years ago, the Polish prime minister actually stated, we want the region to become the center of innovation. So that speaks volumes, on where the Eastern European region would like to go. Just also want to mention it, like Estonia has been emerging as a very international hub for digital transformation type of projects and industries. You've got Slovakia coming out with innovative industries. Even a flying cars was a recent invention there. And yeah, it's quite interesting. Lithuania has a startup visa program in Lithuania. So that, yeah, there's lots happening. Different countries are doing different things, but overall, the sense is very positive. It's exciting. Things are fast moving, and it does, in the end, represent Western culture versus, the potential for a go-to countries being in Asia. Whereas it's a bit different culture from the Western world. So, what we're talking here is the indebted Western world. Where are they going to go to? Where is the brain drain and the wealth drain going to go to? So, Eastern Europe maintains that Westernized culture, but has all these other differences that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I realize your time was limited there, but my overall impression is that English is generally a second language. That you're not going to be faced with some of the language barriers that you would in, say, the so-called stands. The Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and some other places in the world where you're going to run into language barriers. I wonder if that's less of an issue as well in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I didn't have any problem getting around, and it's widely spoken, and it's helpful for anybody trying to do anything in the economy to have English as the language. So Yeah, I would agree with that.
So we're kind of introducing an international aspect to a topic we've talked about before, which is, like where, how capital responds to how it's being treated, right? Both intellectual and financial capital. And so I think before we started recording, we both thought that this was the same dynamic in place, but just there's international opportunities as well as domestic opportunities to move someplace where your capital is going to be treated better than in these over indebted financial repression based states.
Yeah, exactly. And now it's just beginning in the U.S., but more locally, right? So you've got states like Illinois, California, Connecticut that are heavily indebted and reaching the crisis point, in terms of debt at that state level, and also government pension crises in these locations. So as that gets worse, as that intensifies to other states, and not just in the U.S., but Canada, like for example, here in Ontario, where I'm speaking now, the debt per capita is worse than it is in Greece by a factor of 9. So it's
Wow.
9 times worse. It's just a matter of time if you know what happened in Greece. So yeah, the indebted Western world, and that's basically Western Europe, North America, U.S., Canada, and Japan.
Right. And just to kind of recap what everybody kind of knows what's happening in the over indebted West and in Japan, which is the cost of living is so high, and the barriers to entry for new businesses is so high that you've got stagnant economies and social disorder, social ills. So even if there's no demonstrations, what you see in Japan is young people just aren't getting married. They have no interest in getting married and having children, partly because they can't afford it. And so then you go, what's the future of your society if young people can't afford to have a family? I mean,
Exactly.
yeah. And so there's another whole level to financial repression, that when you make it very difficult to survive financially and get ahead, because the cost of living is high due to cartels, monopolies, high taxes, etc., then you're really going to kill your society. And where people can migrate easily, then they will, right? Because it's going to make sense. And what's interesting about that brain drain is there's a feedback loop there, right? In other words, the people who are most motivated to leave are typically the most ambitious, and so you're losing the creme de la creme of your intellectual capital, and then they're going to start bleeding off everybody in the trench just below them, right? As everyone sees all the smart people leaving, then they're going to the next tranche will leave as well.
Yeah, and
And
it's
so then
usually
yeah.
exactly. I mean, it's usually a non-linear effect too, where as you're beginning to explain on that, the idea that it just accelerates, it gets worse and worse, and so on and so forth as the brain drain and wealth drain happens. It just becomes faster and faster, and that actually leads to more draconian measures, more financial repression in an increasing way, which drives out even more brain drain and wealth drain.
Right. And then, of course, I just want to mention there's a lot of beautiful countryside and amazing cities in Eastern Europe, right? I have not explored that to any degree compared to what I've done in France and Switzerland or so on. But nonetheless, even it's obvious that those are tourist locales because of the beauty of the cities and the functionality of the cities, right? I mean, they actually function as far as I can tell.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these cities in Eastern Europe have retained a very strong European architecture and sense, and so that can bring about the tourism as well. as well as maintaining that sort of Western view, Western perspective, Western culture.
Yeah. Wow. Well, you're sort of inspiring me to visit Hungary. And we know that many films are shot in because of cost and the settings. We know that Paris is in a film is often a city in the Czech Republic or
Yes. Yeah.
Hungary, because the setting is similar and the cost is so much lower. So.
Yeah.
Um,
And I just wanted to point out too a recent essay that you put out on your blog entitled "Political and Social Conflict is Accelerating. Here's Why." That also is a dynamic that would play into here. So it's not just about the debt crisis, the pension crisis, cost of living, as you mentioned, all of these other issues, but the political and social conflict. Can you elaborate on that? What you were getting across in that essay?
yeah, thank you for that. That the sort of social divides we see that start with economic divides like wealth and opportunity inequality and a soaring cost of living of essentials. So then you've got the upper, like say 10% managerial class can afford uh, a nice lifestyle still because they have more than enough money for the essentials, and then they have large disposable spending. But the bottom 90%, their wages haven't kept up, and so this wealth inequality and income inequality is driving social disorder. And to some degree, I think you could make the case that France and Germany are are actually powder kegs in this regard, especially France. Germany, slightly different set of circumstances, but still on the edge of social disorder, far more than what you've described in Eastern Europe.
Exactly. Yeah. So to summarize, I mean, we see low taxes, a Western culture, innovation potential, a focus on knowledge-based industries, security, safety, lower wealth inequality, and just an overall unwillingness to go back to extreme socialism and communism.
Those all sound like positives in terms of intellectual and financial capital.
Yep, and it's fully in line. If you can provide a summary based on how it ties to your book Pathfinding Our Destiny, in terms of capital and how it will go to where it's treated well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think, as we've discussed in previous shows, uh, an economy which is decentralized and is systemically more adaptable, right? If you've got a network of nodes and self-organized forms of capital, then that society is more flexible and adaptable and innovative than a rigid, top-down, hierarchical form of capital where monopolies and cartels basically run everything. And so that's kind of the structure that's going to treat capital better, is decentralized, flexible, adaptable, low barriers to entry for enterprise, and and just more systemically flexible and adaptable, and as opposed to a very rigid cartel controlled hierarchy. um, that's a society that's basically guaranteeing collapse, and that's what we're seeing in at the national level in the U.S. and other countries, I think.
Well, that's great insight and just ties right into all of your thoughts from your books. How can our listeners learn more about your work, Charles?
Yeah, please visit me at of2minds.com. There's free samples of all my books. And everything on the site's free in terms of that and the content. So please visit of2minds.com.
Great. And maybe next time we'll be doing the podcast from Budapest, Hungary.
I would love that.
Okay. All right.
Thank you very much, Richard.
The FRA Roundtable Insight Show is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the show each involve their own unique risk factors which are not discussed on the show. Any discussions among the panel participants or responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the panel participants and do not take into consideration the listener's suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Please be advised that you invest or speculate at your own risk.